Bo Nix could be the next Jalen Hurts in the NFL. All that and more in this episode of the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast.
You are Locked On Dynasty Football, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Here are your hosts, Marcus Mosher and Kate Madjuk.
Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That is $200 if your bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Kate Madjuk. You can follow her on Twitter at Kate Madjuk. You can also check her out at Behind the Steel Curtain and Pro Football Focus. On today's show, we are discussing quarterback Bo Nix. We're going to talk about J.J. McCarthy on Monday. I know a lot of you are interested in when we're going to talk about McCarthy, especially after the trade that went down on Friday. But Kate, I'm really excited to talk about Bo Nix. He's one of the more interesting players in the draft. What did you see when you turned on the tape?
Bo Nix is a really interesting player, Marcus, because obviously he was one of the most productive quarterbacks in all of college football this year. Like Heisman finalist, he was a very good quarterback. But I'm going to be honest, walking away from the tape, despite the fact that Marcus, like the stats, everything tells me I should be all in on Bo Nix. I mean, ranked top 5 in passing yards, passing touchdowns, turnover worthy play rate, passer rating, yards per attempt. Like he has really solid athleticism, which we know we love for fantasy football. I generally walked away from Bo Nix's tape kind of overwhelmed and without I think underwhelmed, I guess is the better word, because I don't necessarily know how much I think we're going to see of Bo Nix in the NFL beyond the game manager status. Obviously, the legs give him some of that upside, but you look at, the percentage of throws short of the sticks. You look at the percentage of yards that came after the catch for Bo Nix, it was actually quite high. That turnover worthy play rate, 1%, that's literally led all of the quarterbacks in college football. But I do think it comes at the price of upside sometimes. Obviously, all of these safe kind of throws underneath and all of that, it sets you up for some big plays down the field. I just don't know if I'm as excited for fantasy as I maybe expected to, knowing the kind of athlete that Bo Nix is overall.
Bo Nix is a really tricky prospect because if you just look at the raw numbers, right? He had 45 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. And in fact, one of those interceptions hit off one of his receivers' hands and went right into a defender. So, I mean, he really didn't turn the ball over, but the offense is really simple, right? And I think that's why you saw him get so much better leaving Auburn and going to Oregon, because the offense was just tailor-made for him. Easy throws, wide open receivers, not a lot of press coverage over there in the Pac-12. It was pretty simple for him. So now we have to project, how does that work in the NFL? And that's what's really difficult. He's not the first quarterback that's come from an offense like this, and we just have a hard time projecting. Listen, I'm going to go ahead and say it right now. One of my comps for him is Jalen Hurts. We're going to talk about that a little bit more later in the episode, but Jalen Hurts at Oklahoma was somebody under Lincoln Riley who played in a very easy offense with really, really good receivers, including CeeDee Lamb. And we wondered how he was going to transition to the NFL. So I completely understand, Kate. He is not a clear-cut prospect. And I think what makes this even a little bit harder is that if you watch the Senior Bowl practices, he was fine. He got better as the week went on, and he was good in the red zone period. He was fine, but he didn't wow you. And I think that's what makes this so difficult to rank him, because what are you getting at the next level?
And he's a very experienced quarterback for what it's worth. I mean, obviously, I think Bo Nix is particularly interesting, especially because he does have 5 years experience. So I think, obviously the experience as a true freshman, like showed a lot of promise, then kind of tapered off in his final seasons at Auburn, got a revitalized career in Oregon. And the ups and downs, I think, actually mirror Jalen Hurts's kind of trajectory overall quite well. Like, it, tapered off and then kind of found his resurgence in a new offense. But I still wonder, like, for as much experience as Bo Nix have, I still have like some questions, right?
Sure.
Not the biggest quarterback, overall. He's a fine size. He's not like a big guy, but the stats, everything tells you that, like, from a production standpoint, you should really like Bo Nix, especially in terms of his, dual threat capacity. Didn't have, necessarily as many rushing yards this season as he has in years past. In his first year at Oregon, had 510 rushing yards, 14 touchdowns. But like from a floor standpoint, has actually had a pretty safe floor, contributing on the ground in terms of touchdowns. Never had a season out of his 5 years with fewer than 4 rushing touchdowns, averaging right around like 6 or 7 for most of his
Yep.
career. But and again, like from a fantasy standpoint, you love to see that dual threat capacity. Now, you and I were talking pre-show about some of his strengths and weaknesses. Obviously, his production profile, a huge strength, the athleticism, a huge strength, and that definitely contributed to his ability as a rusher. And also, for as much as I'm giving him flack for throwing short of the sticks, it does help him avoid creating a ton of mistakes while he's playing football. I mean, you look at his last season, 3 interceptions, season before that, 7 interceptions, like never had more than 7 interceptions in a single season throughout his career. Pretty impressive considering you know, overall picture that we're looking at.
I think he's a really interesting prospect. If you look at PFF and you look at the turnover worthy throws last year alone, this is somebody who had, oh man, I don't have the number in front of me, but the amount of attempts he had compared to some of the other quarterbacks in this class was ridiculous. But he had 5 turnover worthy throws. That's it. So he's just not putting himself in harm's danger at all. He also doesn't take sacks at all, Kate, and that's something that we talked about
Mhm.
a lot when it came to Jaden Daniels and Caleb Williams. Those guys were taking a bunch of sacks, and that generally translates to the NFL. If you take a lot of sacks in college, you're going to do it in the NFL. Bo Nix doesn't take sacks, and he doesn't turn the ball over. Now, are you sacrificing some upside and big play potential? Probably. But there are going to be a lot of coaches in the NFL that look at Bo Nix as, hey, if he doesn't take sacks, he doesn't turn the ball over, we can work with that. And he's a plus runner. That's one of the biggest strengths for me. Let's go to his weaknesses, because I think his accuracy can be spotty at times. He'll miss the occasional layup, which is something you don't want to see from a quarterback that you might be drafting in the first round. He also relies a little bit too much on his arms. Sometimes you'll see him falling away, throwing passes. You'll see the footwork be out of sync a little bit. Some of the stuff you can clean up, but it's going to need some work in the NFL. And my biggest question is, can he read defenses? Because coming out of the system, everything was so predefined for him. He knew exactly where to go with the ball on the first read. And if it wasn't there, he has the outlet and then he can run. That's going to be a big transition for him.
And I do think having that question mark in particular, that is probably the scariest thing for me with Bo Nix. It is really hard to have that question still be a question for a 5-year starter.
I agree. I agree, because you're hoping that as you play more, it becomes a little easier for you to read defenses, but the scheme just got more
Mhm.
simpler for him as he progressed to his college career. I still like that he has this many dropbacks and this many passing attempts. For me, it's a positive coming into the NFL, but it does worry me. Like, is it going to take him 2 to 3 years before he's even remotely ready to start? We'll see. I think the draft position and the draft capital will matter a lot there. But overall, a very, very solid prospect. Kate, I want to dive into the numbers because from an analytic perspective, Bo Nix is about as good as it gets. We will get to that next. This episode is brought to you by Robinhood. Did you know that even if you have a 401k for retirement, you can still have an IRA? Robinhood has the only IRA that gives you a 3% boost on every dollar that you contribute when you subscribe to Robinhood Gold. But get this, now through April 30th, Robinhood is even boosting every single dollar that you transfer in from other retirement accounts with a 3% match. That's right, no cap on the 3% match. Robinhood Gold gets you the most for your retirement thanks to their IRA with a 3% match. This offer is good through April 30th. Get started at robinhood.com/boost. Subscription fees apply. And now for some legal info. Claim as of Q1 2024, validated by Radius Global Market Research. Investing involves risk, including loss. Limitations apply to IRAs and 401ks. 3% match requires Robinhood Gold for 1 year from the date of your first 3% match. Must keep Robinhood IRA for 5 years. The 3% matching on transfers is subject to specific terms and conditions. Robinhood IRA available to U.S. customers in good standing. Robinhood Financial LLC, member SIPC, is a registered broker-dealer. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We want to let you know that Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel, Locked On Sports Today. Baseball fans, mark your calendars for March 20th at 7 p.m. Eastern for their best MLB season preview coming exclusively to Locked On Sports Today. On March 20th at 7 p.m. Eastern, be the first to get local insights from the MLB local experts of the Locked On Podcast Network. Find it on March 20th at 7 p.m. Eastern on the Locked On Sports Today podcast or on the free Amazon Fire TV channels. All right, Kate, let's talk about Bo Nix from an analytic perspective because boy, oh boy, are the numbers good.
The numbers are very good, Marcus. You look at his 2023 grade percentiles in all of these advanced stats for PFF, like 90th plus percentile in no play action grade, third and fourth down grade, throws at or beyond the sticks, which, like I said, just despite, just because he threw a high percentage of his pass attempts short of the sticks doesn't mean he can't throw beyond. 99th percentile for sack rate. And again, this is something that we've mentioned pretty much with all of these top prospects. Caleb Williams, Drake May, Jaden Daniels, all of them take far too many sacks. That is not Bo Nix's game. And I do think that also contributes to like putting yourself in these safe situations, which I think Bo Nix, because of all of this, because of, I think a relatively safe floor, because he's not taking sacks, he's not turning over the ball. He reminds me of a game manager with upside. And that's not to say that upside can't be significant because of the type of athlete that he has. I just have questions. And Marcus, how much do you think these advanced stats are going to translate at the next level? Because I do feel like, beyond some of the other top prospects, I do think Bo Nix's landing spot is probably going to be more dependent than some of these other top prospects in terms of that success translating.
I agree. I don't think he can go to any situation and thrive. I think it's going to really depend on where he goes. And for his sake, I kind of hope that he's a second round pick and he lands with somebody or a team that's not going to pressure him into starting right away. Like what I don't want to see happen, Kate, is I don't want to see the Broncos draft him and all of a sudden he's in a situation on a bad Broncos team paired with Sean Payton who wants to win right away. Like I don't think that's an ideal spot. Go somewhere else where you can sit for a year. Again, like Jalen Hurts, go on a team with a loaded roster and then kind of ease your way into becoming a franchise quarterback. I do worry that on the wrong team, he get miscast. He could be asked to be a savior of a franchise, and he just might not be ready to do that because I think it is going to take him a while to get up to speed when it comes to learning and reading NFL defenses.
It's definitely a challenge. I honestly think out of all the quarterbacks that we've evaluated, Bo Nix is the one with the widest range of outcomes, because I think he's got a lot of really, really positive intangible traits, right? Like the athleticism, he's got a solid arm. He is an efficient passer. He doesn't turn over the ball. Like all of these qualities, like if you're describing your ideal franchise quarterback, those are a lot of qualities that you're going to check off the box with Bo Nix. But there's just a couple of these points of hesitancy for me that have me concerned. But I mean, Marcus, this is a dynasty podcast, and I'm going to admit, like, the athletes are generally speaking going to be the cheat code. And in the right offensive system, or in an offense that knows how to exploit his athleticism while also featuring his arm, he's got some upside.
So I want to mention some fits. Now we haven't done this with a lot of the top prospects because we know
We
where
know where they're
Caleb.
going.
Yeah, we know where they're going. So a couple landing spots to me, and again, I my guess is that we're going to get 4 quarterbacks going in the top 6 picks, and then we're going to have a
Drought.
break. Yeah, we're going to have a drought. So if I had to bet today, I think that Bo Nix is going to be a 2nd round pick, but that's okay because I think there's some landing spots that make a lot of sense to me. There are actually 2 of them right in a row. The Raiders at 44 are interesting to me because they need a quarterback. I don't see them getting inside the top 4. Could they draft Bo Nix and then sit him behind Gardner Minshew, who they just signed? And they have Aiden O'Connell. I actually kind of like that fit a little bit. You've got weapons with Devontae Adams, Jacoby Myers, a 2nd-year Michael Mayer. They've got to upgrade their offensive line a little bit, and I'm not so sold on Luke Getsy, but an interesting spot. I think the Saints, who pick at 45, are another one. I know you're not the biggest Derek Carr fan out there. Derek Carr could easily be gone after this year. That is a situation where pretty good offensive line, good receiver core, you're playing in a dome. I think that makes sense. But here's the one for me, Kate.
Don't tell me it's the Eagles at 50.
No. It's not the Eagles
Okay.
at 50. But what's funny is when the Eagles selected Jalen Hurts in the 2020 draft,
It was 53rd overall. So
53rd
not
overall.
too far off.
Yeah. Everybody thought, hey, why are you doing that? You have your franchise quarterback. You don't need to do this. I'm looking at the Rams picking at pick 52.
Ooh.
Matt Stafford getting a little bit older. I think it's clear that he's the franchise quarterback this year. But beyond this year, I do wonder like what it's going to look like there. Could Bo Nix go in a Sean McVay offense where, he doesn't turn the ball over, he doesn't take sacks, you've got weapons, they've upgraded their offensive line, he could sit a year behind Stafford. Like that's a type of situation that would get me really excited.
Yeah, I think that's a great type of situation. I think what you're hoping for, and I do think, like, generally speaking, it's going to be good for Bo Nix to fall out of the first round just because he's probably not going to be asked to step into a starting role right away, which I think is probably going to be important. I'm going to be honest though, beyond the few teams that you mentioned, I'm like not finding a ton of great fits that I'm just absolutely in love with. Like, I'm going to tell you the one really interesting fit that like I keep going back to, and I'm like, man, if this team didn't have their guy, Bo Nix feels like he could be an interesting fit. San Francisco 49ers.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
if they did not have Brock Purdy, or let's say Bo Nix falls and takes a surprising tumble, which we've seen quarterbacks fall in the past, right? Like if he takes a surprising tumble into like the 3rd round, I would love to see the 49ers trade up and take Bo Nix as, call it an insurance policy, call it whatever you want, but the athleticism, the turnover-free football, I think he'd be a good schematic fit. Like all of these landing spots, I think are things that, on paper, maybe year 1 aren't going to do much for his dynasty value. But I think long term, that's probably the best you're going to hope for Bo Nix.
I'll just mention one more. Your Pittsburgh Steelers drafting at 51. Russell
Marcus,
Wilson is on a 1-year deal.
no.
Kenny Pickett's not the answer. But I mean, it's not going to happen. But if you want to like build the perfect Mike Tomlin quarterback, a quarterback that doesn't take sacks, that doesn't turn the ball over and can add value as a runner, like it does make some sense, but it's not
Marcus.
going to happen.
So while we were talking about Bo Nix, and like before the show, we were talking about Bo Nix, and I just kind of gave you my feelings about like their blah, and there's just something that is holding me back. And I realized what it was while I was going to save this for segment 3, but he reminds me of a certain quarterback, and I'll save that for
Okay.
segment 3.
All right. Let's talk about his dynasty value, and we will dive into some player comps next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tournament. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a 1 seed, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all. I can't wait to bet on Caitlin Clark in Iowa. I'm so fired up to watch the women's tournament this year. It's going to be so much fun. Just visit fanduel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We are discussing Bo Nix and his dynasty value. Kate, right now, where is Bo Nix being drafted among quarterbacks in dynasty leagues? Oh, you're on mute right now. It's okay.
That's my bad. So you look at his overall value. Let's first start with where he ranks among rookie quarterbacks. So right now, in terms of overall ranking, courtesy of Fantasy Pros, we have Bo Nix coming in at quarterback 6 among this draft class. So first we've got Caleb Williams, then Jaden Daniels, who is also our quarterback 2, Drake May, JJ McCarthy at 4, Michael Penix Jr. at 5, and finally Bo Nix at 6. That was perfect rhyming. I actually think this is probably right on par with me. JJ McCarthy is the only guy that I'm not totally sure about. I do think you can get Bo Nix, like depending on landing spot, depending on situation, maybe ahead of Michael Penix Jr., who again, like a very efficient passer, but I do think Bo Nix has some of that upside in terms of
Penix is going to fall in this
mobility.
draft.
I think where he's being drafted seems very fair. And then in a super flex league, going 16th overall, which again, I think generally pretty fair. Going behind all of the top end wide receivers, of course, going behind those top quarterbacks, where the value gets kind of interesting, going behind Troy Franklin, Xavier Worthy, Jonathan Brooks, A.D. Mitchell, Trey Benson, Lad McConkey. Like, depending on the landing spot there, I do think that there's a lot of room for Bo Nix to increase some of that value, especially for a team that's rebuilding, who doesn't need a quarterback in year 1, or maybe they're exploring their quarterback room. I think, again, I keep saying, like, the word of the day for Bo Nix is interesting.
Yeah. So I want to mention my player comp. I mentioned it at the front. To me, he reminds me so much of Jalen Hurts. In just the whole transition that Jalen Hurts had to make, going from Alabama to where he was a game manager, got benched for Tua, transferred to Oklahoma. While at Oklahoma, Lincoln Riley let him rip the ball. And that's where he posted big stats and went from a potential day 3 pick to a second round pick with the Eagles. I think very similar situation with Bo Nix when he was at Auburn, was asked to be a game manager in the SEC. He was the freshman of the year, and then just never quite progressed. And actually his game started to regress with Auburn, went to Oregon, put up huge numbers. And now we're talking about him as a borderline first round pick. A lot of the same concerns about Hurts were okay, is his arm good enough to be an NFL quarterback? Yes, I think the same is true for Bo Nix. The athleticism, how effective is he going to be as a runner in the NFL? I don't think Nix is quite as talented as Hurts as a runner, but he is a little bit faster, which is important. He doesn't take sacks. He doesn't turn the ball over. He can be affected a little bit by pressure in the pocket, just like Jalen Hurts. Hurts landed in the most perfect situation for him in his skill set. It's pretty unlikely that that's going to happen for Bo Nix, but if he ended up with the Rams, as we suggested in segment 2, I wouldn't be surprised if he is the best value in this quarterback class.
I think that's all fair. I definitely am looking at Bo Nix in terms of projecting him to the NFL. I can't imagine him ever reaching the ceiling of a Jalen Hurts. From
No.
a collegiate comp perspective, I think that's fair. I'm going to give you a low end comp, and I'm going to be honest. I think this is why I have a little bit of PTSD watching Bo Nix, almost giving me a little bit of shades of Kenny Pickett. And hear me out here, because
Bigger hands, though. That's
better, much bigger hands. I think Bo Nix has 10-inch hands. Is
yeah,
that 10 plus inch hands? Yeah, that's a stark contrast from Kenny Pickett. But the type of player that they are, Kenny Pickett didn't immediately pop out to me on the page while watching Bo Nix. I think Bo Nix has a higher ceiling than Kenny Pickett. But I do think some of the qualities that have, not been a huge asset to Kenny Pickett, despite Kenny Pickett, relatively solid athlete. We saw that at Pitt. Not as good of an athlete as Bo Nix, but that was an element to his game that you had to account for. Occasional big time throws, not huge in terms of turning the ball over. The stable quarterback metrics, I mean, for Kenny Pickett were excellent in his final season at Pitt. You look at the fact that 5-year starter, all of these sort of things, coming out of the draft. Who actually Bo Nix, correct me if I'm wrong, is going to be, I think, just he's only a little bit younger, I believe, than Kenny Pickett. I think just by a nose hair. You have the sort of obviously you have the early breakout for Bo Nix, who then regressed. Kenny Pickett really just had that late breakout, but it still is sort of seeing this player develop at the point where you should see these quarterbacks develop, and not all that much sooner. I don't know. I have some big PTSD issues with Kenny Pickett right now, so maybe I'm being a little bit unfair to Bo Nix, but
can I give you a middle a prospect between the two of those that I keep coming back to? There's parts of his game that remind me a little bit of Drew Lock coming out of Missouri. Drew Lock was a second round pick. Now he doesn't have the same arm that Drew Lock had, but I think in the play style was very similar. I just hope he doesn't end up in Denver.
Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me I'm wrong about Kenny Pickett and Bo Nix. Am I just projecting? I might be projecting.
A little bit. I think Bo Nix is a better prospect coming out than Kenny Pickett. And I like that he's been more productive, because Kenny Pickett really only had that 5th year, where at least Bo Nix had multiple years of really good production. So that does make me feel better. Plus, I just think the tools are better, bigger hands. I think he's got a better arm than Kenny Pickett. I think he's more athletic when it comes to actually running the ball, even though Kenny Pickett tested very well. But I do think that's probably the floor. But I think the ceiling's a little bit higher than that, Kate. So he's a value to me. I'm buying Bo Nix. I almost said Kenny Pickett. I'm buying Bo Nix for where he's being drafted right now.
I think that's fair. And depending on landing spot, I might be all in on Bo Nix. Like I said, I do think he's going to be a guy that, depending on the landing spot, depending on the system that he falls into, I think could be productive in the NFL. I want to see him fall into the right place and not necessarily get high-end draft capital. I'd rather see him fall a bit and land in the right situation.
I agree. Landing spot is going to be very, very important for Bo Nix in determining what his fantasy and his dynasty upside are in the NFL. That is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Dynasty Football your first listen every single day. Go check out the channel on YouTube. We post videos every single day over there. Go download the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We are free and available on all platforms. Go follow Kate on Twitter at Kate Majuk. I'm at Marcus_Mosher. And we will see you right back here on Monday discussing Michigan quarterback J.J. McCarthy.